Welcome back to the Consciousness Formula. We have covered the first three statements. You are the subject of your experience. Subjectivity, consciousness is universal. Therefore, you are universal consciousness. These kind of fit together. We get that we're the subject. We know we're that feeling of being inside, that there's a felt experience of what it's like to be me. Once we realize that what it is like to be me isn't just individual, but universal, that there's only one consciousness looking through all of us. That's the really big takeaway here. Once you get that down, then to see that you are a universal consciousness is a pretty quick thing to see, right? Because now it's not just, I am David or I'm an individual. We see that there's no sense of David. There is a sense of being. That being is universal. There's only one sense of being in the universe. I am that sense of being in the universe. I am universal consciousness. We transcend from thinking we're individuals to realizing we are actually all one. That's the first three statements. But I've got a fourth statement in this formula. All else is content. That's another big leap. I mean, to say we're universal consciousness, fine. When I first realized, universal consciousness, I assumed consciousness was one thing and the physical world was another, and consciousness was interacting with the physical world. So consciousness is perceiving a physical universe, right? Not so fast. So let's think about this a little bit. How do we know the world? We only know the world, what we think of as physical reality, through our experience of it. Yes, we have lots of measuring devices. We've done lots of experiments. We've explored this physical world ad infinitum. But when it all comes down to how we see that and interpret it, we are interpreting it through our senses, filtered through to our experience, and we know it through our experience. The mathematics that go behind science didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Human minds came up with those mathematics. We know those mathematics through our human experience. It is as simple as that. If that is so, how do we know what we are perceiving? Like I said, we perceive through our senses. There's tons of stuff coming in. We filter that down to create the experience we have of the world as we know it. Is that world as we know it exactly what's out there? Well, now we're going to take a little look at evolution, because evolutionary biologists will tell you that the world we perceive is not necessarily accurate. What we perceive, we evolutionarily evolved for survival, right? We don't perceive things to be accurate, to be a complete picture of the actual world. We perceive things so that we can eat, reproduce, and survive. That's our evolutionary direction. We need to eat, reproduce, and survive. As I've heard, we are DNA's way of getting more DNA. Everything about our bodies is tuned to that. Is it useful to know everything that we see out there? No, we need to focus, as I said before, on I need to avoid that lion. I need to hunt that deer. I need to find that fruit. I need to find a mate. I need to reproduce. Everything gears toward that. So we can't really rely on what we get from our senses to give us a complete picture of reality. That's not what it does. It's meant to help us survive. If you took all those filters out, if you didn't filter down to what you think you need to see, really it'd all be just noise. Because there's so many inputs. It's like listening to a radio in between stations. All you've got is this crackling, wild noise. You need to tune it to get to listen to the station. And you're choosing what station you listen to, by the way. So a lot of what's going on here is controlled by your attention. If I focus my attention on what my next meal is, I'm going to find that next meal. So our focus tunes our perceptions to what we need to see to survive. Otherwise, it would all be just noise. So that's number one. While we think we are perceiving physical reality, still kind of saying, there's a physical world out there. We just filter it all down so that we understand it as we need to for our role in this world. Let's take another look at science. Let's look at physics. Since quantum mechanics came along, I talked in the last session about universal consciousness. I talked about the observer problem, all that kind of stuff. As we dig further and further down into quantum mechanics, what we see, what the scientists there are describing, is what they call a quantum soup of probabilities. Everything kind of in superposition and entangled, and nothing really solid until it is observed. And we have a whole range of quantum particles we have found down there in that, as we observe that quantum soup. Electrons, protons, neutrons, bosons, muons, all the ons are all over the place there you can discover. But what they've also determined is underneath each of those particles is a field. The particle is actually the activity of the field. The field is the reality. And until you observe that field, you don't get a solid, determined particle. So that's part of what's going on here. We have a field. And now they're starting to say that underneath all those fields that go with the quantum particles, maybe there's just one field at bottom, one huge, entangled quantum field out of which everything arises. This is kind of getting cutting edge quantum physics now. I don't do the math. I am not that scientist. I'm interpreting what I'm hearing from scientists who do know, who say this, that there is one quantum field at the bottom. Could that quantum field at the bottom, the one universal quantum field, actually be awareness? There are some that are starting to say this now. You're seeing it from Annaka Harris in her Lights On series. Bernardo Kastrup, the philosopher that is the author of Analytic Idealism. And so now, as we look at philosophy, we are actually moving away from materialism and panpsychism into idealism. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. I want to take a quick diversion here to what is it like spiritually? What does mysticism say? If I look at something like the non-duality practices and thinking, they all say awareness is at the very bottom, and it's raw awareness without content. I've said this before. Raw awareness, just the ability to be aware, and then ripples on that field of awareness are consciousness, which is the activity of awareness. Now they go beyond that. So what is it that is out there with the activity of awareness? It's really consciousness looking at itself. So the world we see that we think is a physical world is what they call Maya. It's an illusion created by consciousness. Illusion does not mean it's not real. It means it is not as it appears to be. It appears to be physical. In our daily lives, we might as well interact with everything as it's physical, right? I might as well interact, with this microphone, the couch behind me, the tables, anything I see. For day-to-day living, just act like it's really there and it's physical, because otherwise you'll just get confused and stuff. But what's really underlying that is really consciousness looking at itself. So the world is real, but it is made of consciousness. And the reason it's made of consciousness, as they put it in these various traditions, is if consciousness didn't have something to be aware of, if awareness didn't have something to be aware of, it could not even be aware of itself. So the world comes into being so that consciousness can experience itself. That's at the heart of the mysticism here. What does this look like philosophically? I've talked about this before. One of my favorite audio documentaries by Annaka Harris is Lights On. And the reason I like it so much is she doesn't just talk about this stuff like I am trying to boil it down. It's 11 hours of various episodes that go through the science and philosophy of consciousness. And she interviews all the greatest brains that are out there that talk about this stuff. Whether it's Philip Goff on panpsychism or Brian Greene, the physicist, you will find all the leading lights of all of neuroscience, physics, philosophy in this audio documentary that she's done. She starts her journey actually in a book before Lights On as a materialist. She's assuming it's a physical world. I'm trying to figure out how consciousness rises out of the brain in this physical world. And as she explores this more and more deeply, she can't help but start thinking, maybe consciousness doesn't come from the brain. Maybe consciousness is actually fundamental. And as she grapples with this, is consciousness fundamental? She starts coming to the conclusion, maybe it's the real fundamental thing. Maybe it's what lies all the way at the bottom of reality. And she finally gets to that spot where she says consciousness must be fundamental at the bottom of reality. I encourage you to go listen to this Lights On documentary. The quote I'm going to take out of that is one I love that she says in Lights On. The world is what conscious experiences look like from our filtered view. What does that mean? If consciousness is at the bottom and the world bubbles up from consciousness, then what really we have here are conscious states. And when we're looking at conscious states, we're looking at it through various portals. Each of us is one of those portals that consciousness is looking through, and each of us carries a filtered view, which I think I've talked about before, but it carries a filtered view of what we are seeing. And what we were looking at when we look at someone else is the same consciousness looking back at us through their own filtered view. So we are seeing consciousness seeing itself, if you will. That's what that means, that the world is what conscious experiences look like from our filtered view. The person who has taken this the furthest in a direct philosophy is Bernardo Kastrup. And he has a great book out called Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. It is very heavily philosophical, but if you're into that, he does a great job of going through why materialism doesn't work, all the things, all the exceptions that I talked about in the universal consciousness section that really mean that materialism doesn't add up. He also goes into why panpsychism doesn't really work. Part of it is the combination problem. If everything is conscious, how do you combine those into greater and greater forms of consciousness? And he also looks at it from the point of view of, is there really a physical world at bottom, or is it consciousness at bottom? And he decided basically that at the bottom of the universe is a universal field of awareness or subjectivity. The activity of that subjectivity he calls mind at large. And he thinks of mind at large like you would think of your mind, only now it's a universal mind, and it has memories, it has mental states, it has all this stuff, but it's really in a universal field. It's captured in this universal field of awareness. So that's what's at bottom, universal awareness, and then mind at large. So what are we looking at in the world? The universe itself is made up of mental states of mind at large. So really, a body is a mental complex that is a representation of what that filtered view looks like from the outside by another complex, another mental complex that we will call another body mind. So the universe is made up of these various mental states. Therefore, what we perceive as the physical world is what these mental states look like as perceived by others. What are these others? They are the alters. So I talked about alters in multiple personality disorder, where you can have alternate personalities inside of one body. And he has posited that each of us, individuals, is a dissociated alter, dissociated from each other, of mind at large. And he says why we can't really see hear what each other's thinking, all the mind meld type stuff, is we have these dissociative boundaries. We have dissociated from consciousness at large, created a dissociative boundary so that consciousness can perceive itself out in the world and sees all these other mental complexes. So that's the idea of an alter with a dissociated boundary. And when you think about it, even our own bodies that we perceive are a mental representation of our own mental complexes in his theories. So we are what our alter complexes look like from the outside. One paradigm he has, or one analogy, if you want to put it, that he uses to try to get the point across on our perception and what we're actually seeing out there, and it not being physical reality, is he talks about the dashboard in the cockpit of an airplane. And if you've ever seen the cockpit of an airplane, it's got lots of screens and gauges and buttons and all sorts of stuff. And they tell you a lot about what's going on out there. They give you wind speed, they give you altitude, they can give you attitude of the plane. There's radar out there to tell you, is there a storm out there you need to be aware of? All of those things on the dashboard aren't reality. They're a representation of reality that is useful to us for flying the plane. If I look out the cockpit window, I don't see wind speed. I see I'm traveling through the air, if you will, but I don't see wind speed. I don't feel wind speed. I don't see my altitude, but I need that information. So everything on that cockpit dashboard is giving me the information I need to navigate to get where I need to go. It is not by any stretch of the imagination the actual reality, right? My wind speed gauge gives me a number. I don't feel wind speed as a number, but that's what it gives me. What he is saying is our perception gives us a dashboard view of reality. And it's about as real as those instruments on the cockpit. The fact that I see a table and that thing says table is a representation of something else, not an actual physical table. Just like, 185 miles of wind speed is a representation on a gauge, not the actual experience of wind speed. So that's his dashboard concept. I've also heard this likened by other philosophers to the idea of icons on a computer screen. Excuse me. We are all very aware of icons on a computer screen. We manipulate them all the time. I've got a file folder. I move a file from this folder to that folder. I open up an application from a little box on a little icon on my desktop that lets me open up Word and type words into Word, all that kind of stuff. Excuse me. But I don't even think that the icons and all the stuff I see on my screen is what's underneath it. Underneath it is a computer with a bunch of ones and zeros sitting in memory chips and being processed through central processing units. It's a bunch of electrons running around, doing their thing based on the direction we give it. If we had to manipulate all the electrons running around inside of a computer, we could never do what we need to do on a computer. So what we see is a monitor with a bunch of icons that make representations to us of what's going on under there that are useful for getting our work done on the computer. What we are seeing and thinking is reality out there is actually icons on our computer that allow us to manipulate and work with reality. They are not the reality in itself. That's the fundamental category mistake we make when we think that we perceive a physical world. It's not a physical world. The physical world is the icons on the computer screen that we are interacting with. So that's kind of the basis of this all else is content, right? What we are seeing out there are these icons of mental states of consciousness. Therefore, everything we are perceiving are contents of consciousness. There is no separate physical world that our consciousness interacts with. There is only consciousness presenting consciousness to itself through this kind of dashboard or computer screen interface. So why is that? If awareness is what we are at bottom, just pure raw awareness, why is there something rather than nothing? Why isn't it just all blank, just white noise? All we are is just one field of awareness with white noise. Well, one of the things awareness wants to do is be aware. It wants to be aware of something. And so it creates that something. The world we perceive, the universe we perceive, is awareness's way of becoming conscious of itself. And that's a real important thing here. That happens, we can say that not just from our philosophy standpoint in something like analytic idealism, all the mystics have talked about that too. They talk about awareness is at the very bottom, and raw awareness is without content, and consciousness is the activity of awareness, but what is the world? They talk about Maya in Hinduism as an illusion created by consciousness. Not that it's not real, but it's not what it seems to be. It is actually a world made of consciousness of itself. So this concept goes thousands of years back. But as we're starting to progress in philosophy and things like analytic idealism, we're coming back to those concepts of idealism. Quick little side note here, just because I want to make it. The great philosopher of consciousness, David Chalmers, who posited the hard problem of consciousness, also said, and I'm paraphrasing here, philosophers of consciousness all start as materialists, become panpsychists, and end up as idealists. And I think you've seen in the last few questions here or statements here that I've gone through, I think you have seen in the statements that I have gone through here that progression, that the thinking starts as materialist, we go to panpsychism, but now we are ending at idealism, where what we are is consciousness experiencing the contents of consciousness. So all else is content. There's nothing but consciousness and the contents of consciousness. That is where we wrap up these 4 questions. And I'm going to review that and do a little wrap up here. So we have now been through all 4 statements. You are the subject of your experience. We are the subject of our experience. Subjectivity, consciousness is universal. Therefore, you are universal and all else is content. You can see how those fit together now. It's obvious that I'm the subject. Not so obvious that the subject is universal, but we spent a lot of time looking at why, and yeah, you know what? There's only one consciousness, one subjectivity looking through all of us. Therefore, you are universal consciousness. This is not some offhand statement. So of the 4 statements, I think it's pretty easy to see we're the subject of our awareness. We're the subject of our experience. Universal consciousness says there's one subject, only one subject, looking through each of us. So that individual you experience inside is an illusion. There's only one of us in the world. When someone says, I have a soul, no. There's only one soul looking through all of us. That's what it means to be universal consciousness. When you start thinking, I need to take care of my own, and I need to take care of my family and what's mine, there's no mine. There's only one looking through all the myriad beings of the universe. And so you are that one universal subject looking through all these different portals. And finally, we now see that as I'm that one universal subject looking through all these portals, what I'm looking at is myself, not some physical world out there. That's a handy representation like icons on a computer screen that allows me to work inside of this world that consciousness has actually created. So we end up being consciousness experiencing the contents of consciousness. This has some profound impacts for how we live our lives. Even without a full awakening experience, if you at least intellectually grasp that when I look at someone else, I'm looking at myself looking back at me, you're going to be inclined to treat them differently. You're not going to be inclined to say, I need to win this competition over them. I need money and I'm going to get it from them because I need it to enhance my lifestyle. No, we're all one. You're going to try to make life better for everybody else on the planet. Not just you, because you are the only one out there. It changes how we live our lives profoundly. With a full awakening experience, that becomes a felt experience of oneness, and you have no choice but to operate in that way. And I'll give you an example of that. I'll give you my personal story of my own awakening experience that I had back in 2011, which actually kind of shocked me when it happened. I was a former business executive. At the time, I was a vice president in a software company. I was flying across the country from San Francisco to Florida for a business conference. Pretty typical thing to do. Except, being who I am, was I reading a business book? Was I reading something on the latest theories of project management, which was the field we were selling into? No, I was reading Erwin Schrödinger's What is Life? Because these questions have been my focus all of my life. That's what I did on the side. I read about, studied about, practiced, meditated, all that kind of stuff. The very last page of What is Life, Schrodinger makes the conclusion that when you look at it, there can only be one mind. There can only be one consciousness. It's the only way everything he talks about works. Whether it's the observer effect, whether it's how evolution has occurred, whether it's how biology works, which he covers a lot in that paper, his conclusion is there must be only one. Consciousness is one. The number of minds in the universe is one. And I set that paper down. And I kind of leaned back and I meditated for a while. And suddenly it hit me. Oh, yeah, that solves it all. If consciousness is universal, all those questions I had about who I am, about how the universe works, about what's happening in physics versus are psi phenomenon real, are near-death experiences real, what's going on there, it solves absolutely all of that. But that didn't occur to me as a thought. It was more like a bunch of stuff just rewired itself in my brain. My perception changed instantly. And when I opened my eyes, all I saw looking back at myself was myself. If I looked at someone else on the airplane, I saw myself. It wasn't when I look in someone else's eye, I see myself and it's something similar to myself. It was exactly me. Me here, me there, me everywhere. And it was just such a profound, deep experience. And a couple of things happened right away when I had that experience. First of all, the fear of death just disappeared. Because who's going to die? I'm universal consciousness. David's body comes and goes. All these bodies come and go. I am the one thing that remains. Consciousness. Awareness. So the fear of death went away. Compassion leapt to the forefront because I could see all these people that were going about their lives and trying to make what they could of their individuality and how they suffer in their lives, whether it's mental suffering because of, whether it's psychological trauma, physical pain, I felt that as if it was happening to me, because it was happening to me. So my compassion for others shot through the roof. It had no choice. That was huge. My own suffering kind of went away. So physical pain didn't go away. Hit me with a baseball bat, I'm going to feel it, I'm going to scream, I'm going to go, oh, that hurts. And then it's done. Suffering is what the mind does when it thinks it's an individual. It goes something like this. Someone hits me with a bat. God, that hurts. Why me? Why did they attack me? What did I do to them? They're horrible people. I need to get back at that person. I need to make sure they know what they've done is wrong. And it goes on and on and on. That mental looping is the suffering we cause ourselves, over and above the pain. I would contend with you that 80 to 90% of what you feel as suffering and pain is mental noise. The pain itself comes and goes usually quickly. So that happened as well. I came out of this experience, I got off the plane, there was a huge smile on my face. The other thing that happens with the compassion when you see other people and you see just you looking back at you, is I fell in love with absolutely everybody I met. It's all me. And so I was in love with the world. I actually call that day the day I lost myself and fell in love with the world. And the peak of that experience lasted about 2 years. Not a day or two, an hour or two, a couple of years. And that experience buried itself into my core and still sits there in my core. And I go about my daily life like anyone else would go about their daily life. The saying, what'd you do before awakening? Chop wood, carry water. What'd you do after? Chop wood, carry water. Very true. From the outside, you wouldn't know much at all. It's buried very much in my core, but it's there. It's my perspective. It's my view of the world. Even if sometimes I don't express it that way, because the world wants me to act like an individual human. But that's what awakening feels like. And that's where I think we are going as a human species. We're not here. Consciousness is evolving constantly. We see the world as consciousness evolving across time. And it's heading toward greater and greater unified awareness. And we're on the threshold of taking that next step. And when we do, the world will change. The wars will go away. The hunger will go away. We can feed everyone on this planet easily. We don't because we hoard for ourselves to keep secure. That keeps from others. If you see others as yourself, you do not do that. You take care of everyone. So the world will transform once this paradigm shift of oneness occurs. So I'm going to leave you with a thought here about this consciousness formula and about my lifelong quest of the question, who am I? And I encourage you to take up this question, who am I? And get to that same spot, which is at the end of the question, who am I? Is a oneness that can transform the world. That's where I want us to go. Thank you.